Donald Trump takes another step up in the trade war with China and announces a new 10% tariff on imports coming from the Asian country, which until now hadn't been affected by the dispute. In a brief meeting with press, the U.S. president has been blunt. We've recorded Chinese products sold in our country worth $300 billion. For a long time, China has been taking hundreds of billions every year. We have rebuilt China. It's time to change the terms. If they don't want to do business with us anymore, that's just fine by me. We'll save a ton of money.
The shipment of 2,566,000 cars to the United States, which accounted for 74% of Mexico's total light vehicle exports in 2018, is at risk if the threat of a 25% tariff is carried out, experts say. Once again, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, threatened to impose tariffs on cars imported from Mexico. Since his presidential campaign, Trump has criticized the automotive industry for opening plants in Mexico. The pressures, now as president, led to the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement.
A sad week for Mexico and China. Donald Trump, the new president of the United States, openly declares war on any electric car that China wants to sell on American soil. However, why would Mexico be severely affected? And it's that China wants to deliver the final blow to the global control of automakers, slowly advancing, step by step, in the North American market, the second largest in the world. The strategy is very simple, and in my view, it's a chess move. Selling electric cars to people with lower purchasing power. And the assembly plants would be in Mexico. Look at this car, for example, a BY, the Dolphin Comfort, one of the top 10 best-selling cars in the world. If you look up reviews on YouTube, you'll see that its users are in love. A range of 400 kilometers with the air conditioning on. Imagine being able to get it for the ridiculous price of $11,000. A strategy that China wants to use to break all the numbers of Ford and GM. Sadly, in my country, Argentina, the cheapest car is a Fiat Mobi, a 1.0 engine, with 60 horsepower. Its price is $21,000, and its quality is among the worst ever seen in Fiat. That's why today we'll see if Trump will be able to stop this Chinese advance over Latin America and the United States. But before we continue, welcome to this new video. It's my duty, as always, to ask you for a like, and if it's your first time here, welcome, subscribe. Thank you very much. China is strongly boosting its industrial presence in Mexico, especially in the automotive sector, with a focus on electric vehicles. In Aguascalientes, Chery, one of the Chinese automotive giants, began operations in 2022, making the city one of its first centers in Mexico. Querétaro has also become a strategic point due to its industrial and advanced manufacturing infrastructure, attracting the interest of several Chinese automotive companies to establish assembly plants. In the central part of the country, BYD is considering 3 potential locations in states like Michoacán, Jalisco, and Guanajuato, where the proximity to automotive supply chains and logistical positioning are attractive factors. Additionally, Great Wall Motors has shown interest in establishing itself in Mexico, driven by the advantage of exporting from Mexico to other markets in America, avoiding tariffs that Xi Jinping's investments face in the United States, especially in the automotive industry. They are part of a broader strategy for expansion in Latin America, driven by the need to avoid trade barriers and ensure production closer to key markets. These investments respond to several factors, like the saturation of the Chinese market, trade tensions with the United States, and the rising tariffs on Chinese products in the U.S. market. By setting up plants in Mexico, Chinese manufacturers can access free trade agreements that allow exports to Latin America, and in some cases even to Europe and the United States without facing the same tariff restrictions, something that the new president considers one of the worst threats in recent times. Donald Trump has launched criticisms, warning that he won't allow huge Chinese car plants in Mexico to threaten the U.S. industry. This marks an intensification of its stance, suggesting possible further restrictions. And in a context of geopolitical tensions, could he end up blocking these vehicles for national security reasons? Due to their integrated technology that could collect sensitive data, it would be the perfect excuse to look good in front of Americans who are eagerly waiting to buy cars at low prices. The backlash against China in the United States also responds to a context of tension in which both Europe and North America are imposing barriers to the entry of technology and Chinese manufacturing, not just to protect their industries, but also due to security concerns. With these measures, Trump is trying to strengthen the protectionist rhetoric that defines his strategy and appeals to voters worried about jobs and industrial dominance in their own territory. The context surrounding the rising tensions between the United States and China, along with the role that Mexico plays as a pillar in the global automotive supply chain, creates an increasingly complicated trade battleground, especially for companies like Ford. The company, for example, has heavily invested in Mexico, establishing the production of electric vehicles like the Mach-E, which is mostly exported to the U.S. market. This move has put Ford in the crosshairs of Donald Trump, who, in his election promises, insists on heavily penalizing the import of cars manufactured in Mexico with tariffs of up to 300%, a strategy to force automotive manufacturing to remain on US soil. Of course, time will tell if these are just empty promises for a desperate people watching their jobs disappear, or if we will truly witness a level of protectionism like never before, both from China and North America. Ford's reliance on the Mexican market is significant and is part of a strategy that optimizes costs and meets the growing demand for electric cars in the United States. However, the difficulties it faces in China due to the slowdown in sales further complicate its position, since Mexico represents one of the safest bets to maintain competitiveness. Ford's current situation in the Chinese automotive market is alarming and poses a significant challenge for the US automotive industry. In the face of the flood of low-cost, advanced technology electric vehicles produced by Chinese brands, Ford has found itself in a precarious position to the point where its CEO, Jim Farley, has labeled Chinese electric cars as an existential threat to the American industry. These Chinese models outperform American and European vehicles in terms of range and price, which has led to American cars quickly losing ground in one of the largest markets in the world. The panic is not unjustified. Now dominated by domestic manufacturers, the Chinese citizen is increasingly less interested in imported goods, especially those from the United States. Years of nationalist advertising, subsidies and, above all, pride in the economic miracle. It rapidly rejects all types of foreign industry, something that has been happening for decades around the world with everything made in China. With this protectionist policy and a possible blockade of American vehicles, China could ensure that its own electric models dominate not only its own market, but also expand internationally at ridiculous prices. Let's not kid ourselves, the ones most likely to come out on top this time are the Asian dragon. This country is in a unique position to hit the American automotive industry hard by strengthening protectionism in its own territory. If it decided to block the entry of foreign cars or impose higher tariffs on them, the effects would be devastating for Ford and other American companies, which are already facing difficulties in the Chinese market. The threat goes beyond just competition in sales. If China decides to formalize a blockade or raise tariffs on cars from companies like Ford, General Motors, or even European brands, American manufacturers could lose access to a market of nearly 30 million buyers a year. In this context, China's policies could not only weaken the finances of these companies but also cut one of the last bridges that Western companies have with the Asian market. But it's not just sales that Ford would lose. Let's talk a bit about how much supply China is currently providing to all these brands, from complete engines like the PureTech for Peugeot, even brake pads. If China were to adopt protectionist policies, the impact on the global automotive supply chain would severely affect both American brands like Ford and European brands like Stellantis, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen, as many rely heavily on Chinese components and materials for their electric vehicles and advanced engines. Foreign automakers rely on China not only for the manufacturing of essential parts but also as one of their largest consumer markets. Any restrictions on the export of critical materials, like batteries and semiconductors, or an increase in tariffs, would drive up the production costs of vehicles outside of China, which would impact the final prices of cars in international markets. Additionally, China has argued that the recent investigations by the European Union into subsidies for Chinese electric vehicles are a protectionist measure that will distort the global supply chain. Beijing has warned that it could take retaliatory measures. This could affect the position of foreign brands in the Chinese market, where they currently have high demand, especially German brands. China also controls a significant part of the electric vehicle value chain, such as lithium mining and battery production, which exacerbates the poor quality of power. The vulnerability of foreign brands if trade restrictions intensify. Let's talk a bit about Europe. The ones in the worst position in all of this and who have everything to lose are the ones with governments that are doing absolutely nothing to save their brands. On one hand, the United States, through the Inflation Reduction Act, offers subsidies for electric vehicles that are assembled on its territory. This incentive excludes many foreign automakers unless they relocate part of their production to the United States, which would be costly and logistically complex for European manufacturers. For Volkswagen and other German companies, this situation could significantly reduce their access to the US market and, in general, to North America. China, meanwhile, has toughened its stance towards Europe in response to Brussels-led investigations into dumping in the electric car sector. In potential retaliation, it could impose tariffs or other restrictions on European brands, affecting their sales in one of the most dynamic and fastest-growing markets. While France and other European countries advocate for protectionist measures to safeguard their national industry, Germany takes a more cautious stance due to its significant investment in the Chinese market. Dumping is a trade practice where a company or a country sells products in a foreign market at a price lower than in its local market, or even below the cost of production. The goal is usually to gain market share by artificially lowering prices to push out local competitors. This can negatively affect companies in the importing country, as they face unfair competition and may be forced to lower their prices or even shut down. Let's not kid ourselves. The ones most likely to come out on top this time is the Asian dragon. This country is in a unique position to hit the US automotive industry hard by strengthening protectionism on its own territory. If it decided to block the entry of foreign cars or impose higher tariffs on them, the effects would be devastating for Ford and other American companies, which are already struggling in the Chinese market. The threat goes beyond just competition in sales. If China decides to formalize a blockade or raise tariffs on cars from companies like Ford, General Motors, or even European brands, US manufacturers could lose access to a market of nearly 30 million buyers a year. In this context, China's policies could not only weaken the finances of these companies but also cut one of the last bridges that Western companies have with the Asian market. But it's not just sales that Ford would lose. Let's talk a bit about how much supply China is currently providing to all these brands, from complete engines like the PureTech for Peugeot, even brake pads. If China were to adopt protectionist policies, the impact on the global automotive supply chain would hit both American brands like Ford and European brands like Stellantis, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen hard, as many rely heavily on Chinese components and materials for their electric vehicles and advanced engines. Foreign automakers rely on China not only for the manufacture of essential parts, but also as one of their largest consumer markets. Any restrictions on the export of critical materials, like batteries and semiconductors, or an increase in tariffs, would raise the production costs of vehicles outside of China, which would impact the final prices of cars in international markets. Additionally, China has argued that the recent investigations by the European Union into subsidies for Chinese electric vehicles are a protectionist measure that will distort the global supply chain. Beijing has warned that it could retaliate, which could affect the position of foreign brands in the Chinese market, where they currently have high demand, especially the German brands. China also controls a significant part of the electric vehicle value chain, like lithium mining and battery production, which worsens the vulnerability of foreign brands if trade restrictions ramp up. Let's talk a bit about Europe, the ones in the worst position in all of this and have everything to lose, with governments that are doing absolutely nothing to save their brands. On one hand, the United States, through the Inflation Reduction Act, offers subsidies for electric vehicles that are assembled on its territory. This incentive excludes many foreign automakers unless they relocate part of their production to the United States, which would be costly and logistically complex for European manufacturers. For Volkswagen and other German companies, this situation could significantly reduce their access to the US market and, in general, to North America. On the other hand, China has taken a tougher stance against Europe in response to investigations into dumping in the electric automotive sector, driven by Brussels. As a potential retaliation, it could impose tariffs or other restrictions on European brands, affecting their sales in one of the most dynamic and fastest-growing markets. While France and other European countries haven't done any of this, do European countries advocate for protectionist measures to protect their national industry? Germany is taking a more cautious stance due to its heavy investment in the Chinese market. Dumping is a trade practice in which a company or country sells products in a foreign market at a price lower than that of its local market, or even below the cost of production. The goal is usually to gain market share by artificially lowering prices to push out local competitors. This can negatively affect companies in the importing country, as they face unfair competition and may be forced to reduce their prices or even close down. This bad business practice is more commonly associated with countries or companies from emerging economies, like those in China, that seek to enter international markets with low prices. However, some European brands have been accused in the past of similar practices in specific markets, although it's not a common or sustained strategy among major European automakers due to high production costs. In other words, we punish countries that want to sell cheap cars. No, folks, that's not good for the consumer. The buyer is more than willing to pay a premium for unnecessary technologies or for engines that only last 10,000 kilometers. Yes, sir, that's how it is. During the Trump administration from 2017 to 2021, trade protectionism was a prominent policy, mainly through the imposition of significant tariffs, particularly against China and the European Union. These measures aimed to protect U.S. industries and pressure other countries to change their trade practices. In 2018, Trump imposed a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum, justifying the measure on national security grounds. This action not only impacted China but also allied countries like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. In response, the European Union and other countries retaliated with their own tariffs on American products, which impacted sectors like agriculture and automotive in the U.S., raising the costs of goods and reducing American exports. In addition, Trump sparked a trade war with China, imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The so-called Phase 1 of the trade agreement between North America and China in 2020 aimed to increase Chinese purchases of American products and open up certain markets, but in practice, China didn't meet all its commitments, and the impact on the trade balance was minimal. Trump's protectionism also included threats of widespread tariffs to pressure countries like Mexico to reduce immigration to the United States, which had temporary effects on some agreements, but generated lasting trade uncertainty and market volatility. But anyway, let's get back to cars and what we can expect in the short term. If Trump were to impose severe tariffs on vehicles assembled in Mexico, especially those from Chinese brands, American consumers would lose access to more affordable vehicles. This would create a price war effect, where local brands like Ford and Stellantis would raise prices since they wouldn't face affordable competition. Furthermore, European brands such as Volkswagen and Peugeot already charge high prices in Europe, so such a policy would reduce competition and increase costs for consumers, limiting the availability of affordable vehicles. Without competition from cheaper vehicles, brands such as Stellantis and Volkswagen, which already sell expensive vehicles in Europe, could keep prices high on both sides of the Atlantic. This would prevent middle-income buyers from accessing affordable vehicles, since the lack of options and tariffs would make even low-end cars more expensive. In the long term, the measure would increase inequality in access to modern and efficient vehicles. Additionally, the effects of a price war would force Chinese brands and local manufacturers in Mexico, unable to sell in the United States, to raise prices or cut production, directly impacting thousands of Mexican workers in the automotive industry. Older folks can easily remember how Japan was also seen as a serious threat to the North American market. In the 70s and 80s, the United States tried to build a protective wall around its automotive industry, convinced that no foreign force could penetrate its fortress on wheels. But, oh, how wrong they were. Japan, with its cleverness and precision, not only breached American defenses, but turned the North American car market into its own playground. While the Detroit giants kept cranking out massive gas-guzzling cars, Japan rolled out small, efficient vehicles that won over American consumers during the energy crisis. Japanese cars weren't just affordable, they also offered a quality and durability that American brands just couldn't match. Brands like Toyota and Honda became synonymous with reliability and longevity. While American industry rested on its laurels, Japan took aim at the pandemic, was betting on technology. The introduction of advancements like front-wheel drive and sophisticated electronic systems left American cars looking like relics of the past. North America's response was a desperate attempt at protectionism. Import quotas, taxes, and regulations tried to hold back the Japanese wave, but they were as effective as a sand dam against a tsunami. Instead of evolving, the American automotive industry got stuck, relying on the government to save them from fierce competition. By the late 1980s, Japan had achieved the unthinkable, dominating the American automotive market. American nostalgia for their muscle cars was left in the rearview mirror as millions of Americans fell in love with the reliable, efficient, and technologically advanced Japanese cars. It wasn't just in the automotive sector where Japan made an indelible mark. The rise of Japanese cars in the United States brought about a cultural and media shift. Movies, television, and advertising started to reflect this new reality. Who could forget Marty McFly in Back to the Future dreaming of a Toyota truck? The American working class, especially in Detroit, the heart of the automotive industry, faced days of uncertainty and crisis. Thousands of workers saw their jobs threatened by this unstoppable Japanese wave. There were protests, demands for subsidies, and a nationalist clamor to buy American. But the consumer's shout was louder. They wanted reliable, efficient, and affordable cars. Finally, the American automotive industry was forced to reinvent itself. Companies began to adopt Japanese manufacturing techniques, such as Toyota's famous just-in-time, which revolutionized production. The competition forced American manufacturers to improve quality and innovate technologically. Today, the relationship between the United States and Japan in the automotive world is one of collaboration and healthy competition. Brands like Ford and GM have regained ground, while companies like Toyota and Honda continue to lead in innovation and global sales. This story, which started with tensions and protectionism, has evolved into a coexistence where both nations have learned and grown. Dear friends, I really appreciate it if you made it this far. Could Trump bend a little in front of the Chinese empire? I'll read you in the comments.